The gunshot that echoed through the mountain pass was not meant for Violet Montgomery, but it changed her life forever nonetheless, sending her stagecoach careening off the narrow trail and into the rocky ravine below, where everything she thought she knew about survival would be tested by a man who lived beyond civilization's reach. Violet had been traveling from St. Louis to meet her intended husband in Sacramento, a banker named Harold Pritchard, whom she had never met but who had promised her father a comfortable life in exchange for her hand. It was 1876, and such arrangements were still common among families of modest means who wanted security for their daughters. At 22 years old, Violet had resigned herself to this fate, packing her trunks with the few precious belongings she owned and boarding the westbound stage with a heart full of trepidation, but a mind determined to make the best of circumstances beyond her control. The other passengers had been a grizzled prospector heading back to the goldfields, a matronly woman traveling to visit her sister, and a young cavalry officer returning to his post. When the outlaws attacked on that narrow mountain, pass through the Colorado Rockies, Violet had watched in horror as the driver took a bullet to the shoulder and lost control of the reins. The horses panicked, the coach lurched violently to the left, and suddenly they were falling, tumbling down the steep embankment in a chaos of splintering wood and terrified screams. When Violet opened her eyes, she found herself lying in a twisted heap of wreckage at the bottom of a ravine, her body aching in a dozen places but miraculously intact. The matronly woman lay nearby, clearly dead from a broken neck. The cavalry officer was gone, likely thrown clear during the descent. The prospector groaned somewhere beneath the overturned coach. But it was the approaching darkness that truly frightened Violet, more than her injuries, more than her isolation, more than the possibility that the outlaws might come looking for survivors to rob or worse. She had been afraid of the dark since childhood, ever since the night her younger brother had died of fever, and she had sat alone with his small body until morning, waiting for her parents to return from town. That darkness had seemed alive with menace, full of whispers and shadows that reached for her with cold fingers. Every night since then had been a battle against that primal terror, one she had learned to manage in the safety of civilized places with lamps and candles and other people nearby. But here in this remote canyon, with night falling fast and no help in sight, that old fear rose up in her throat like bile. "Help," she called weakly, her voice barely carrying past the wreckage. "Someone please help us." The prospector had stopped groaning. Violet tried to move, to crawl toward where she had heard him, but pain shot through her left ankle and she cried out. It was not broken, she thought, but badly twisted. She managed to drag herself to a sitting position against a boulder, her traveling dress torn and stained with blood from a dozen scrapes and cuts. The shadows were already deepening in the ravine, the sun sinking behind the western peaks. In another hour it would be fully dark. Terror clawed at her chest. She looked around desperately for something, anything she could use to make a light. The coach had a lantern, but it was somewhere beneath the wreckage and likely broken anyway. She had no matches in her reticule, no flint, nothing. The darkness was coming and she could not stop it, could not fight it, could only wait for it to swallow her whole. That was when she heard the footsteps, heavy and deliberate on the rocky slope above. Her first thought was that the outlaws had come back, and she shrank against the boulder, trying to make herself small. But the figure that emerged from the tree line was not an outlaw. He was enormous, easily 6.5 feet tall, with shoulders as broad as an ox yoke and a thick black beard that covered half his chest. He wore buckskin trousers and a leather shirt, with a fur cloak thrown over his shoulders despite the lingering warmth of the September evening. A rifle was slung across his back, and a large hunting knife hung at his belt. His hair was dark and long, tied back with a strip of rawhide, and his eyes were the color of storm clouds, sharp and assessing as they took in the scene of destruction below. A mountain man. Violet had heard tales of such men, trappers and hunters who lived alone in the high country, away from towns and people, as wild and dangerous as the beasts they hunted. Fear and hope warred in her chest as he made his way down the slope with surprising agility for someone his size. He reached the wreckage and immediately went to the prospector, checking for signs of life. After a moment, he shook his head and moved on to the dead woman, treating her body with surprising gentleness as he straightened her limbs and closed her eyes. Then his gaze found Violet, huddled against her boulder, and he approached slowly as if she were a wounded animal that might bolt. "You hurt bad." His voice was deep and rough, like rocks grinding together, but there was no threat in it. "My ankle," Violet managed to say. "I think it is twisted. And cuts and bruises, but nothing serious, I think. There was an officer, he might have been thrown clear, and the driver, I do not know what happened to him." The mountain man nodded and began searching the area methodically, moving away from Violet and climbing back up the slope. She watched him go with rising panic, the darkness gathering thicker now, the first stars beginning to appear in the strip of sky visible above the ravine. He was leaving her. He had seen that she was not immediately dying, and he was leaving her here in the dark. "Please," she called out, hating the tremor in her voice. "Please do not leave me here." He paused and looked back at her, his expression unreadable in the fading light. "Looking for survivors, I will be back." True to his word, he returned 15 minutes later, by which time the ravine was deep in shadow and Violet was shaking uncontrollably, her breath coming in short gasps as the darkness pressed in around her. He was carrying the cavalry officer over his shoulder like a sack of grain. The young man was unconscious but breathing. The mountain man laid the officer down carefully, then turned his attention to Violet. "Can you walk?" "I do not think so. My ankle will not hold me." Without a word, he bent and scooped her up in his arms as easily as if she weighed nothing at all. Violet stiffened in surprise, then clutched at his leather shirt as he began carrying her up the steep slope. His strength was astounding. He moved steadily upward despite the burden of her weight and the treacherous terrain, never stumbling, never pausing to rest. She could feel the solid muscle of his chest and arms, the steady rhythm of his breathing, and the warmth radiating from his body. "What about the officer?" she asked. "We'll come back for him. You first because you are conscious and scared. Fear is more dangerous than injury sometimes." It was a perceptive observation, and it made Violet look at him more closely. His face was weathered and lined, probably in his early 30s, with a scar cutting through his left eyebrow. But his eyes held intelligence, not the brutish simplicity she had expected from a man who lived like an animal in the wilderness. He carried her to a clearing about 100 yards from the ravine, where a sturdy pack mule was tethered to a tree, and a small camp was already established. A fire ring held the cold remains of a previous fire, and various supplies were neatly arranged beneath a canvas tarp. He set Violet down gently on a bedroll near the fire ring, then immediately set about building up the fire. Within minutes he had flames crackling cheerfully, pushing back the darkness, and Violet felt something in her chest loosen and unclench. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for the fire." He glanced at her, nodded, then headed back down toward the ravine. Violet watched him go, then turned her attention to the fire, feeding it with her eyes, letting the light wash over her and soothe her jangling nerves. The mountain man returned twice more, first with the officer whom he laid on another bedroll, and then with salvaged supplies from the wrecked coach including Violet's trunk. which had somehow survived intact. Once everything was secured, he finally sat down by the fire and began examining the officer's injuries. The young man had a nasty gash on his head and what looked like a broken arm, but nothing life-threatening. The mountain man cleaned and bound the wounds with practiced efficiency, then turned to Violet. "Let me see that ankle." Violet hesitated, then lifted her skirts enough to reveal her boot. He unlaced it carefully and eased it off, his large hands surprisingly gentle. She hissed in pain as he probed the swollen joint. "Badly sprained but not broken. You were lucky. Going to hurt for a while, though." He pulled a jar from his supplies and opened it, revealing some kind of pungent salve. "This will help with the swelling." He applied the salve with the same gentle efficiency he had shown the officer, then wrapped her ankle in clean strips of cloth. Violet watched him work, fascinated despite her exhaustion and fear. He moved with the confidence of someone who had tended many injuries, who had lived long enough in a hostile environment to learn the skills necessary for survival. "What is your name?" she asked. "Thomas Jennings." "Most folks call me Mountain Tom, though I have not spoken to most folks in near about 5 years. I am Violet Montgomery, from St. Louis. I was traveling to California to meet my intended husband when the outlaws attacked." Thomas nodded, not looking up from his work on her ankle. "Those outlaws have been working this pass for the last month. I have been tracking them, trying to find their camp. Heard the gunshot and came to investigate." "Did you see where they went?" "They rode north, probably heading for their hideout in the high country. I will find them eventually." He finished wrapping her ankle and sat back on his heels. "Your husband is expecting you in California." "He is not my husband yet. We have never met. It was an arrangement made by our families." Something flickered in Thomas's eyes, too quick to interpret. "I see. Well, you will not be traveling anywhere for at least a few days, not with that ankle. And the officer needs time to recover before he can ride. We will stay here until you are both fit to travel." "Where is here exactly?" "About 30 miles southwest of the old mining town of Silverton, Colorado. Deep in the San Juan Mountains. The nearest settlement that can help is probably 2 days' ride from here, longer if you are injured." Violet's heart sank. 2 days at best before she could reach help, maybe more. She had no money to pay for her passage onward, the stagecoach having been prepaid by her father. She had no idea what had happened to the driver or if anyone would come looking for survivors. Her whole carefully planned future had disintegrated in a single afternoon, leaving her stranded in the wilderness with a mountain man and an unconscious cavalry officer. As if sensing her distress, Thomas stood and moved to his supplies, returning with a tin cup of water and some dried meat. "Eat. Drink. You have had a shock and your body needs fuel." Violet accepted the offerings gratefully. The meat was tough and heavily salted, venison she thought, but it tasted better than anything she had eaten in days. As she ate, darkness fell completely around their small camp, held at bay only by the cheerful fire that Thomas kept fed with steady additions of wood. She found herself watching him as he moved around the camp, checking on the officer, tending to his mule, organizing supplies. He moved with the easy grace of someone completely at home in this environment, someone who needed nothing from civilization, who had chosen this solitary existence deliberately. "Why do you live out here alone?" she asked. Thomas was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. "Because out here, the only thing that can hurt you is nature, and nature is honest. It does not lie, does not betray, does not pretend to be something it is not. You know where you stand with a mountain lion or a blizzard. You cannot say the same for people." There was old pain in those words, deep and carefully buried. Violet wanted to ask more, but exhaustion was crashing over her in waves now that the immediate danger had passed. Her eyes kept drifting closed despite her best efforts to stay awake. "Sleep," Thomas said, his voice gentler than before. "I will keep watch. The fire will burn all night." "I am afraid of the dark," Violet heard herself say, the words slipping out before she could stop them. "I have been since I was a child. I know it is foolish, but I cannot help it." Thomas looked at her for a long moment, something shifting in his storm-gray eyes. "It is not foolish to fear what has hurt you before, but you do not need to be afraid tonight. I will be your light forever." The words struck something deep in Violet's chest, a resonance she did not fully understand. She wanted to respond, to say something meaningful in return, but sleep was pulling her under like a riptide. Her last conscious image was of Thomas sitting by the fire, his rifle across his knees, his broad shoulders silhouetted against the flames as he kept his vigil through the night. When Violet woke, the sun was already high overhead, and the camp smelled of cooking meat and coffee. She sat up with a groan, every muscle in her body protesting the movement. The cavalry officer was still unconscious but breathing more easily now, his color better than it had been the night before. Thomas was crouched by the fire, turning strips of meat on a flat stone that he was using as a makeshift griddle. "How did you sleep?" he asked without turning around. "Better than I expected, given everything. The fire helped." Violet looked around the camp, seeing it properly for the first time in daylight. It was a well-chosen site, sheltered by tall pines and positioned near a small creek that burbled cheerfully over smooth stones. The mule was grazing peacefully nearby, and various supplies were organized with military precision beneath the canvas tarp. Thomas brought her a tin plate with meat and some kind of flat bread. "Elk steak and journey cakes. Not fancy, but it will keep you strong." "It smells wonderful. Thank you." Violet accepted the plate and began eating. The meat was tender and flavorful, seasoned with herbs she could not identify. "You are a very good cook. You learn when the alternative is starving or choking down raw meat." He settled down across the fire from her with his own plate. "How is your ankle this morning?" Violet flexed her foot experimentally and winced. "Painful, but I think the swelling has gone down some. Your salve must be working. Give it a few more days. Sprains are tricky. You rush them and you end up with permanent damage." He glanced at the officer. "He should wake up soon. Head wounds are unpredictable, but I have seen worse that healed fine. You have experience with this kind of thing." "I was a field surgeon during the war. Learned more about wounds and dying than any man should have to know." Thomas's voice was flat, emotionless, but Violet could hear the weight of memory beneath the words. "After it was over, I could not go back to regular doctoring. Could not stand to be in towns around people, pretending everything was normal when I had seen what we did to each other. So I came up here. The war ended 11 years ago. Has it? Sometimes I am not so sure." He stood abruptly, clearly uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. "I am going to scout around, make sure those outlaws are not coming back this way. You stay here, keep the fire going, and call out if the officer wakes up." Before Violet could respond, he had shouldered his rifle and disappeared into the trees with barely a sound. She watched him go, then turned her attention to the fire, feeding it carefully the way she had seen Thomas do. The flames danced and crackled, pushing back against any shadows that might try to creep too close. The officer woke near midday, confused and in pain. Violet did her best to comfort him, explaining what had happened and where they were. His name was Lieutenant Andrew Carr, 24 years old, and he had been returning to Fort Garland after a brief leave. He was worried about his delayed arrival and the report he would have to file about the attack. "There were 4 of them," he told Violet, his voice strained. I got a good look before we went over the edge, led by a man with a red beard and a scar across his nose. They have been hitting stages all along this route. Thomas returned as the lieutenant was speaking and listened intently to the description. Red Ned Granger and his gang. They have a hideout somewhere in these mountains, but they move around a lot. I will find them. You are going after them alone. Lieutenant Carr tried to sit up and failed, falling back with a grimace. That is suicide. They are armed and dangerous. So am I. Thomas's voice was matter of fact. But not today. Today I am keeping you two alive and getting you healed up enough to travel. Over the next 3 days, a strange routine developed in the mountain camp. Thomas proved to be an attentive and skilled caretaker, changing bandages, preparing meals, and keeping the fire burning constantly for Violet's sake, even during the day when it was not really needed for warmth. He ranged out each morning to hunt and scout, always returning before dusk with fresh game or fish from the creek. Lieutenant Carr improved steadily, his headaches fading and his broken arm beginning to heal in the splint Thomas had fashioned. Violet found herself watching Thomas more and more, fascinated by the contradictions he represented. He was huge and intimidating, capable of obvious violence, yet he touched the injured with gentleness and spoke to them with patient consideration. He lived like a hermit, but he was clearly educated, using words and references that spoke of learning and culture. He claimed to have rejected civilization, yet he was risking his own safety to care for 2 strangers. On the 4th evening, when Lieutenant Carr had fallen asleep early and it was just Violet and Thomas by the fire, she finally asked the question that had been building in her mind. Why did you really come up here? And please do not tell me it was just the war. I think there is more to it than that. Thomas was quiet for so long that Violet thought he was not going to answer. Then he sighed, a sound like wind through canyon walls. I had a wife, Sarah. We married before I went off to fight. She promised to wait for me, and I believed her because I was young and stupid and I thought love meant something. I came back 4 years later and found she had married my brother, claimed I was dead, and moved into my father's house with him. My whole family had accepted it, embraced it even. They looked at me like I was a ghost when I showed up, an inconvenient reminder of a past they had moved on from. Violet's chest tightened with sympathetic pain. That is horrible. I am so sorry. I tried to stay, tried to make peace with it, but I could not. Every day was torture, seeing them together, seeing my family choose him over me. So I left. Packed what I could carry and headed west, kept going until I ran out of civilization. Been up here ever since, trapping and hunting, trading furs when I need supplies. It is a simple life, but it is honest, and no one can hurt me up here except myself. Loneliness can hurt you too, Violet said quietly. Thomas looked at her, really looked at her, and something passed between them in that moment, some recognition or understanding that went beyond words. What about you? Why are you letting your family send you off to marry a stranger? Because I do not have a choice. My father lost his business last year and we have nothing. Harold Pritchard offered enough money to save my parents from destitution in exchange for a well-bred wife who could help him rise in Sacramento society. It was not a difficult decision to make. You do have a choice. You could say no. And do what? Watch my parents starve, live on the streets. At least this way they will be provided for, and I will have a comfortable home even if I do not have love. That is a hell of a way to live. Perhaps, but it is the way that lets me sleep at night knowing I did what I could for the people who raised me. Violet stirred the fire with a stick, watching sparks spiral up into the darkness. Besides, love is not guaranteed to anyone. The arranged marriages I have seen are no less happy than the love matches, and often they are more stable because both parties know what they are getting into. You deserve better than stability. You deserve someone who sees you as more than a transaction. The intensity in his voice made Violet look up sharply. Thomas was staring at her across the flames, his gray eyes reflecting the firelight, and the expression on his face made her breath catch in her throat. It was hunger and longing and something deeper, something that spoke to the hollow place in her own chest that she had been trying to ignore. "Thomas," she whispered, not sure what she was asking for. He stood abruptly. "I am going to check the perimeter." He vanished into the darkness beyond the fire, leaving Violet alone with her racing heart and confused thoughts. She had known this man for less than a week. She was promised to another man, a man she had never met, but who had paid good money for the privilege of marrying her. She had no business feeling this pull toward Thomas, this growing certainty that being near him was where she was meant to be. But she did feel it, and judging by the way he had looked at her, he felt it too. The next morning, Lieutenant Carr announced that he felt well enough to travel, at least on horseback if they went slowly. His arm was healing cleanly and his head no longer ached. Thomas agreed that they could make the journey to Silverton, where the lieutenant could send a telegram to his fort, and Violet could make arrangements to continue on to California. The thought of leaving filled Violet with unexpected despair. She had come to love these mornings waking to the smell of Thomas's cooking, these evenings by the fire talking about everything and nothing, these days watching him move through the wilderness with such confidence and capability. She had come to love the way he kept the fire burning all night without complaint, the way he checked on her ankle every morning, the way he listened when she talked as if her words actually mattered to him. She had come to love him, she realized with a jolt of recognition. Somewhere between the terror of the crash and the comfort of his care, she had fallen completely and irrevocably in love with Thomas Jennings, mountain man and hermit, a man who had been hurt so badly by the world that he had abandoned it entirely. They broke camp that morning, Thomas loading the mule and helping both Violet and the lieutenant mount up. He had salvaged a horse from the wreck, a sturdy bay mare who had somehow survived the fall, and Violet rode her while the lieutenant took Thomas's mule. Thomas himself walked, leading them through the forest trails with the confidence of someone who knew every tree and stone. They traveled slowly, stopping frequently to rest and to check on the injured. Thomas had fashioned a crutch for Violet so she could dismount and walk short distances, taking pressure off her ankle. The country they passed through was breathtakingly beautiful, all towering peaks and deep green valleys, crystal streams and meadows full of wildflowers. Violet had never seen anything like it, and she found herself understanding a little of why Thomas had chosen to make this his home. They camped that night in another clearing, and again, Thomas built up the fire without being asked, keeping it bright and warm against the mountain darkness. Lieutenant Carr fell asleep quickly, exhausted by the day's travel. Violet sat by the fire, her injured ankle stretched out before her, and watched Thomas as he checked their supplies and prepared for the next day's journey. "We should reach Silverton by midday tomorrow," he said without looking at her. "You will be able to send word to your people in California, arrange for new travel." "Yes, I suppose I will. The lieutenant can escort you the rest of the way if you wait for him to heal fully. Or you can probably join up with another stage or wagon train, Thomas. Or if money is an issue, you could work in Silverton for a few months, save up enough for passage. There are always places looking for respectable women to work, Thomas." He finally looked at her, and she could see the pain in his eyes, the carefully controlled emotion that he was trying so hard to hide. "What? I do not want to go to California." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. Thomas stared at her, his hands still on the pack he had been organizing, his whole body gone tense. "You do not mean that. You are just shaken up from the accident, grateful to me for helping you. It will pass. It will not pass." Violet struggled to her feet, balancing on her good leg, and Thomas immediately moved to help her, but she waved him off. "Listen to me. I am not some foolish girl who cannot tell the difference between gratitude and genuine feeling. I am 22 years old. I have been responsible for running my father's household for 6 years, and I know my own mind. I do not want to go to California to marry a man I have never met. I want to stay here with you. You cannot stay here. This is not a life for you. There is no society, no comfort, no safety. Just me and the mountains and whatever we can hunt or trap. You would be miserable. I would be miserable in California, married to a stranger, living a lie for the rest of my life." She took a hobbling step toward him. "The only time I have felt truly alive, truly myself, was these past few days with you. You see me, Thomas, not as a commodity or a burden or a solution to a problem, but as a person. Do you have any idea how rare that is? Violet, you do not know what you are saying. I have nothing to offer you. No house, no money, no future. You have yourself. That is more than enough." Thomas shook his head, backing away from her. "I will hurt you. Everyone I have ever cared about either hurts me or gets hurt because of me. It is better if you just go to California, live your life, forget you ever met me." "I will not forget you. I could not if I tried." Violet's voice broke on the words. "And I do not believe you are the poison you think you are. You saved my life. You have been nothing but kind and gentle and patient, even though I know it goes against your nature to let anyone get close. You have kept the fire burning all night every night, even though you do not need it, just because you knew I was afraid. That is not a man who hurts people. That is a man who cares deeply but is terrified of showing it. You do not understand. Then help me understand. Talk to me. Do not shut me out." Thomas stood frozen, visibly warring with himself. Lieutenant Carr snored softly from his bedroll, oblivious to the drama unfolding by the fire. The flames crackled and popped, casting dancing shadows across Thomas's anguished face. "I am afraid," he finally said, the words barely audible. "I am afraid that if I let myself care about you, if I let myself hope that maybe I could have something good again, it will all fall apart and I will end up even more broken than before. I have built walls for a reason, Violet. They keep the pain out. They also keep everything else out. Joy and connection and love." She took another step toward him, close enough now to reach out and touch his arm. He flinched but did not pull away. "I am afraid too. I have been afraid my whole life, of the dark and of failure and of never mattering to anyone, but you make me feel brave. You make me want to take risks, to choose my own path instead of the safe one that was chosen for me. Please do not send me away. Please let me stay. Your family will disown you. Your intended will be furious. You will have nothing. I will have you if you want me." Thomas looked down at her hand on his arm, then up into her eyes, and she watched something crack open in his expression, some last defense crumbling under the weight of his own longing. "I have wanted you since the moment I pulled you out of that wreck," he said hoarsely. "I have been lying to myself every day since, telling myself it was just protective instinct or loneliness. But the truth is I am already in love with you, Violet Montgomery. I love the way you watch the fire like it is the most beautiful thing you have ever seen. I love the way you ask questions about everything, the way you think about the world. I love your courage and your honesty and the fact that you chew your bottom lip when you are worried. I love you and it terrifies me." Violet felt tears spilling down her cheeks, but she was smiling through them, her heart so full she thought it might burst. "Then be terrified with me. We can figure out everything else together." Thomas cupped her face in his large, calloused hands, thumbs brushing away her tears with infinite gentleness. "Are you sure? Really sure? Because once we do this, once you choose this path, there is no going back to your old life." "I do not want my old life. I want a new one with you, whatever that looks like." He kissed her then, soft and careful at first, as if she might break, then deeper as she responded, her hands fisting in his leather shirt to pull him closer. The kiss tasted of wood smoke and wild places, of promises and possibilities, of two lonely people finding home in each other against all odds. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Thomas rested his forehead against hers. "I will be your light forever," he murmured, repeating the promise he had made that first night. "I swear it on everything I am." "And I will be yours," Violet replied. "No more living in the dark for either of us." They stayed wrapped in each other's arms for a long time, swaying slightly, the fire burning bright beside them and the stars wheeling overhead in their eternal dance. Lieutenant Carr continued to snore, having missed the entire momentous conversation. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, Violet knew. She would have to write to her family and to Harold Pritchard, explaining her decision and accepting whatever consequences came from breaking the arrangement. She would have to learn how to live in the wilderness, how to survive in conditions that would have seemed impossible to her a week ago. She would have to become someone new, but she would not be alone. Thomas would teach her, guide her, keep her safe and warm and loved. Together they would build something real, something lasting, something that belonged only to them. They reached Silverton the next afternoon, a rough mining town clinging to the mountainside, full of prospectors and merchants and the kind of rough characters that spring up wherever there is money to be made from the earth. Thomas arranged for rooms at the only boarding house in town and settled Lieutenant Carr there to continue his recovery. The lieutenant had noticed the change between Thomas and Violet, but had been tactful enough not to comment directly, only offering Violet his best wishes and telling her he hoped she would be happy. Violet composed 2 difficult letters, one to her parents explaining that she could not marry Harold Pritchard and begging their forgiveness, and one to Pritchard himself apologizing for the broken engagement and releasing him from any obligation. She offered no detailed explanation beyond saying that her circumstances had changed and she would be remaining in Colorado. Let them think what they wanted. She could not control their reactions, only her own choices. Thomas sold some of his furs to the local trading post, converting them to enough cash to buy supplies they would need for the winter. He also purchased a sturdy mountain horse for Violet, a pretty paint mare with intelligent eyes and a gentle temperament. They spent 3 days in Silverton, waiting for Violet's ankle to heal fully and for Thomas to complete his business. During that time, they walked through the town together, and Violet experienced the strange looks and whispered comments that followed them. A rough mountain man and a refined young woman from the east made an odd pair, and people noticed. Violet found she did not care. Let them stare. She was happier than she had ever been, even in these few days of navigating this new reality. Thomas held her hand as they walked, his grip warm and strong, and pointed out plants and landmarks, teaching her the names of things, beginning her education in wilderness survival. He bought her practical clothing from the general store, sturdy wool trousers and flannel shirts that scandalized the shopkeeper, but that Violet knew she would need for the life ahead. On their last night in town, Thomas took her to a small church on the edge of the settlement and asked the minister there to marry them. The ceremony was simple, witnessed only by the minister and his wife, with Violet wearing her least damaged dress and Thomas in his buckskin best. They had no rings, no flowers, no celebration afterward. But when the minister pronounced them husband and wife and Thomas kissed her there in the little church with the evening light streaming through the windows, Violet knew she had made the right choice. This was real. This was true. This was the life she was meant to live. They rode out the next morning, heading up into the high country where Thomas had his main camp. It was a 2-day journey through increasingly rugged terrain, following trails that Violet would never have known were there if Thomas had not shown her. They climbed higher and higher until the air grew thin and sharp, until the trees became twisted and stunted, until they finally crested a ridge and looked down into a hidden valley that took Violet's breath away. A small lake nestled in the center of the valley, its waters so clear and blue they seemed to reflect the sky perfectly. Thick forests of pine and aspen surrounded the lake, and meadows full of late-season wildflowers spread out in splashes of purple and gold. A creek fed the lake from the north, tumbling down from the snowfields on the peaks above. And on the eastern shore, sheltered beneath a huge rocky overhang, stood a small but sturdy cabin built from hewn logs and fitted together with obvious skill. "This is home," Thomas said quietly. "I built it 5 years ago when I first came up here. It is not much, but it is solid and warm, and the valley provides everything we need to survive." "It is beautiful," Violet breathed, "like something from a dream." They rode down into the valley as the sun began to set, painting the peaks in shades of rose and gold. Thomas showed Violet around the cabin, which was indeed small but well constructed, with a stone fireplace, a sleeping loft, and a covered porch that faced the lake. He had built shelves for supplies, fashioned furniture from wood and leather, and created a small workshop in one corner where he worked on traps and tools. Outside there was a smokehouse for preserving meat, a shed for storing firewood, and a small fenced garden that had clearly been neglected during his recent travels, but that could be revived. "The valley is sheltered enough that we do not get the worst of the winter storms," Thomas explained as he helped Violet down from her horse. "And there is enough game to keep us fed, plus fish in the lake and creek. We will need to stock up heavily before the snow comes, but we have time." Violet looked around at this place that would be her home, trying to imagine herself living here month after month, season after season, with only Thomas and the wilderness for company. Instead of fear, she felt a deep sense of rightness, of pieces falling into place. This was where she belonged. That first night in the cabin, Thomas built a fire in the hearth, and they sat together on the fur-covered bed he had made, talking about practical things like food storage and winter preparations, but also about dreams and hopes and the life they would build together. When Violet began to grow drowsy, Thomas pulled her close and kissed her properly for the first time since their wedding, taking his time exploring her mouth, her neck, the sensitive skin behind her ear. His touch was reverent, almost worshipful, as if he still could not quite believe she was real and she had chosen him. They made love slowly that night, learning each other's bodies with patience and care, Thomas constantly checking that she was comfortable and consenting, Violet surprised and delighted by the tenderness this huge, dangerous man showed her. Afterward they lay tangled together beneath thick furs, the firelight playing across their skin, and Violet felt safer and more content than she ever had in her life. "I will keep you warm," Thomas murmured into her hair. "I will keep the darkness away. I will be your light always." "And you are my home," Violet replied. "My love, my everything." The weeks that followed were the most challenging and rewarding of Violet's life. Thomas began teaching her the skills she would need to survive in the mountains. She learned to shoot, to fish, to recognize edible plants and track game through the forest. She learned to tan hides and smoke meat, to identify weather patterns and predict coming storms. Her hands, soft from years of gentle domestic work, grew calloused and strong. Her body, unused to such constant physical labor, became lean and tough. It was hard work, far harder than anything she had done before, and there were days when she was so exhausted she could barely move. But there was also joy in the accomplishment, in mastering new skills, in becoming capable and self-sufficient. Thomas was an excellent teacher, patient and thorough, always ready to demonstrate again or explain another way. He praised her successes lavishly and helped her learn from failures without judgment. They fell into a rhythm, a partnership that felt natural despite how different their backgrounds were. Thomas hunted and trapped, bringing in the game they would need to survive the winter. Violet took over the cooking and preserving, revived the garden, and managed to get a late crop of root vegetables before the first frost, and began tanning the hides that would become clothing and blankets. In the evenings they would sit by the fire, Thomas repairing equipment or crafting new tools while Violet worked on sewing projects, and they would talk about everything under the sun. Violet learned more about Thomas's past, the details he had been too guarded to share before. He had been the oldest son of a prosperous family in Missouri, educated at a good college, engaged to marry Sarah, who was the daughter of his father's business partner. When the war came, he had volunteered as a surgeon despite his father's objections, thinking he could help save lives. Instead, he had spent 4 years in hell, sawing off limbs and sewing up wounds and watching young men die from injuries and infections he was powerless to prevent. The Sarah he returned to was not the woman he had left. She had been 19 when he went away, sweet and innocent. By the time he came back, she was harder, more calculating. She had married his younger brother James within months of Thomas being reported missing in action, even though she had received no confirmation of his death. When Thomas showed up alive, she and James and Thomas's father had closed ranks, presenting a united front that made it clear Thomas was not welcome. His mother had been sympathetic but too weak to stand against her husband. His younger sister had been sent away to live with relatives before Thomas returned, presumably to spare her the awkwardness of the situation. "I think that was what hurt the most," Thomas admitted one evening. "Not Sarah's betrayal, though that was bad enough. But my father choosing James over me, acting like I was the problem for surviving when they had all moved on. He actually told me it would be better for everyone if I just went away and let them pretend I had died like they thought. My own father." Violet held him as he spoke, her heart breaking for the young man he had been, returning home traumatized and broken only to have that final support torn away. No wonder he had fled to the wilderness. No wonder he had sworn off human connection. Thomas also learned about Violet's life, the quiet desperation of her final years in St. Louis. Her father had been a textile merchant, moderately successful until a series of bad investments and the economic panic of 1873 had wiped him out. Violet had watched her family slide from comfortable middle-class existence into near poverty, her mother growing thin and anxious, her father drinking more and more. The offer from Harold Pritchard had seemed like salvation, even though it meant sacrificing Violet's own hopes for the future. "I used to dream about love," she confessed. "Real love, the kind you read about in novels, a partnership of equals, someone who would see me for who I really was. But then reality set in, and I realized that most women do not get that. Most women get duty and obligation, and making the best of whatever hand they are dealt. I thought I had made peace with it, but I was just burying my disappointment." "You will never have to bury anything with me," Thomas promised. "I want to know every part of you, even the parts you think are not worth knowing, especially those parts. They talked about children too, cautiously at first, then with growing excitement. Violet was not pregnant yet, but they both hoped it would happen. Thomas had always wanted to be a father, but had given up on the idea after his exile. Now it seemed possible again, one more impossible dream that Violet had restored to him. "I want them to grow up free," Thomas said one night, his hand resting on Violet's flat stomach as if he could will a child into existence there. Free from the expectations and judgments of society, free to be exactly who they are. We can teach them to be strong and kind and honest. We can give them a different kind of life. They will be so lucky to have you as a father," Violet murmured. "You have so much love to give, even if you try to hide it behind your gruff mountain man exterior." "I am not gruff." "You are absolutely gruff. You practically growl sometimes." "That is not gruff. That is just my voice." Violet laughed and kissed him, and the conversation dissolved into other, more physical expressions of their love. Winter came to the high country in late October, early even by mountain standards. The first snow fell during the night, and Violet woke to a transformed world, everything draped in white and sparkling in the morning sun. Thomas had prepared well. The cabin was stocked with preserved meat and dried vegetables, flour and cornmeal, coffee and tea, all the staples they would need to last until spring. They had plenty of firewood stacked under cover, furs for warmth, and all the equipment Thomas needed to continue trapping through the winter months. The snow fell again and again, each storm adding to the accumulation until the valley was buried under several feet of powder. They were truly isolated now, cut off from the outside world until spring thaw. The only tracks in the snow were theirs and those of the animals Thomas hunted. It should have been frightening, Violet thought, being so alone and so dependent on their own resources. Instead, it felt like freedom. Thomas kept his promise about the fire. Every evening as dusk fell, he would build up the hearth until flames leaped and crackled, filling the cabin with warmth and light. He never let it burn out completely, even during the day, banking the coals and feeding them periodically so that there was always light available if Violet needed it. It was a small thing, but it meant everything to her, this constant physical reminder that he understood her fear and cared enough to accommodate it. In turn, Violet worked to draw Thomas out of the shell he had built around himself, to coax him back into connecting with the world beyond their valley. She told him stories from books she had read, plays she had seen, conversations she had overheard. She asked him about his medical training and got him talking about anatomy and physiology, subjects that clearly still fascinated him despite his painful memories of the war. She encouraged him to teach her not just survival skills, but also the things he loved, like the patterns of animal behavior and the subtle signs that predicted weather changes. Slowly, cautiously, Thomas began to relax, to let his guard down fully. His smiles came more easily. His laughter, rare and rusty at first, became more frequent. He started to dream again, to make plans beyond just surviving to the next season. He talked about improvements he wanted to make to the cabin, about expanding the garden, maybe even about taking some furs down to trade in the spring and using the money to buy a few luxuries. "We could get books," he suggested one evening. "I know you miss reading. And maybe some coffee that does not taste like dirt. That would be wonderful, but I am happy with what we have. I know you are. That is part of what makes you so incredible. You never complain, never act like you are too good for this life even though you could have had so much more. I have everything I want right here." Violet looked around the small cabin, at the fire crackling merrily in the hearth, at Thomas stretched out beside her on their fur-covered bed, at the simple but sufficient home they had created together. This is more than enough. Christmas came and went, marked only by a special meal that Violet prepared and small gifts they had made for each other. Violet gave Thomas a new shirt she had sewn from the softest deerskin, with intricate beadwork on the shoulders that she had learned to do from a book Thomas owned. Thomas gave her a beautiful knife with a carved bone handle, perfectly balanced and sharp, the kind of tool that could save her life in an emergency. "Every woman who lives in the mountains needs a good knife," he said, as he showed her how to wear it on her belt. "And every husband needs a wife who knows how to use it." Winter deepened and the storms became fiercer, sometimes trapping them in the cabin for days at a time, but they never felt confined. They had each other, and that was enough. They played card games that Thomas taught her, checkers with pieces he had carved years ago, word games that turned silly and competitive. They made love frequently and passionately, their bodies learning each other's rhythms and preferences, their connection deepening with each intimate encounter. In late January, Violet missed her monthly bleeding. She said nothing at first, not wanting to raise false hopes, but when February came and went with no sign of it, she finally told Thomas. He had been splitting wood outside the cabin and she had called him in, suddenly unable to contain the news any longer. "I think I am with child," she said simply. Thomas dropped the log he had been carrying, his face cycling through shock, disbelief, and then pure radiant joy. He crossed to her in 2 long strides and swept her up in his arms, spinning her around despite her laughing protests. "A baby. We are going to have a baby." He set her down carefully, his hands immediately going to her stomach. "How do you feel? Are you sick? Do you need anything?" "Should you be resting more? I am fine. Better than fine. I feel wonderful." Violet covered his hands with hers. "Are you happy?" Happy does not begin to cover it. Thomas knelt down so that his face was level with her stomach and spoke directly to it. "Hello in there, little one. Your papa is going to make sure you have everything you need to grow strong. And your mama is going to teach you to be brave and smart and kind. We are going to love you so much." Violet felt tears streaming down her face, overwhelmed by the tenderness of the moment. This huge, damaged man who had sworn off the world was kneeling before her, talking to their unborn child with such love and hope that it made her chest ache. She had given him this, the chance to be a father, to build a family, to believe in the future again. And he had given her freedom and partnership, and a love more real than anything she had ever imagined. The rest of that winter passed in a blur of preparation and planning. Thomas became even more protective, insisting that Violet rest more and take on fewer physically demanding tasks. He took over most of the heavy work, fussing over her health and diet with an intensity that would have been annoying if it had not been so clearly rooted in love. Violet tolerated his hovering with good humor, understanding that this was his way of processing his fears and hopes about impending fatherhood. Spring came late to the high country, as it always did. The snow began to melt in March, but did not fully clear from the valley until mid-April. As soon as the trails were passable, Thomas made a trip down to Silverton to trade furs and stock up on supplies. He was gone for 3 days, the longest they had been separated since their marriage, and Violet missed him desperately, despite the fact that she had the cabin and the valley to herself. He returned laden with goods including fabric for baby clothes, better medical supplies in case anything went wrong with the birth, and a stack of books that Violet fell upon with delight. He had also brought news from the outside world, most of which they cared little about, but one piece of information caught Violet's attention. Lieutenant Carr recovered fully and returned to his fort, Thomas reported. and he sent word through the trading post that Red Ned Granger and his gang were captured in March by the territorial marshal. Apparently, someone tipped off the law about their hideout. They are all in custody now, awaiting trial. Violet noticed that Thomas looked particularly satisfied as he delivered this news. Someone tipped them off. Someone might have anonymously provided detailed information about the gang's location and activities to the marshal's office when I was in town, Thomas admitted. I tracked them to their hideout back in November, before the heavy snows came. Figured it was better to let the law handle it than to try to take them on myself and risk leaving you widowed. That was the right choice. Violet kissed him. I am glad they will face justice, but I am more glad that you are here with me, safe and whole. Summer in the mountain valley was glorious. The meadows exploded with wildflowers, the lake warmed enough for swimming, and the forest teemed with life. Violet's pregnancy progressed well, her body changing and swelling with the life growing inside her. Thomas was attentive and amazed by every development, talking to the baby constantly, pressing his ear to Violet's stomach to listen for movement, reading aloud from books in the evenings so the child would know his voice. They spent long days preparing for the baby's arrival, Thomas building a cradle from smooth pine and Violet sewing tiny clothes from the soft fabric he had brought from town. They talked about names, arguing good-naturedly about preferences. They made plans for how they would manage once the baby arrived, who would do what tasks, and how they would adjust their routines. We will figure it out as we go, Thomas said, when Violet expressed worry about her inexperience with babies. No one really knows what they are doing with the first child. We will learn together, and we will have all winter to focus on nothing but keeping our baby healthy and loved. In late August, when the mountain nights were just beginning to cool, Violet went into labor. Thomas had been preparing for weeks, studying his old medical texts, gathering supplies, making sure he knew exactly what to do. But when the moment actually came, Violet could see the fear in his eyes, the terror that something might go wrong and he might lose her or the baby or both. I will be fine, she assured him between contractions. Women have been doing this since the beginning of time, and I have you, which is more than most women have. I am going to take care of you, Thomas promised. Both of you, I swear it. The labor was long and difficult, lasting through the night and into the next day. Thomas stayed with Violet the entire time, coaching her breathing, supporting her when she needed to walk, holding her hand when the pain became overwhelming. He kept the fire blazing even though it made the cabin hot, because he knew Violet needed the light to feel safe. And when the baby finally came, slipping into the world with an outraged cry just as the sun began to set, Thomas caught his son with steady hands and tears streaming down his face. "A boy," he said hoarsely, placing the baby on Violet's chest. "We have a son." Violet looked down at the tiny red-faced creature squalling against her and felt love crash over her like a wave. He was perfect, absolutely perfect, with a shock of dark hair and Thomas's gray eyes and tiny fists that waved in the air as he cried. Their son. Their miracle. "Hello, little one," she whispered. "Hello, my darling boy." They named him Joshua Thomas Jennings, and he was the center of their world from that moment forward. Thomas proved to be a devoted father, patient and gentle with the baby, changing nappies and walking the floor with Joshua when he was fussy, singing to him in a surprisingly good baritone voice. Violet recovered well from the birth, and they settled into the chaotic rhythm of new parenthood, exhausting and overwhelming and more wonderful than either of them could have imagined. That winter was harder than the previous one, with a colicky baby keeping them awake at night and demanding constant attention. But it was also richer, full of small miracles like Joshua's first smile, his first laugh, the way he would track them with his eyes and reach for them with his tiny hands. Thomas was transformed by fatherhood, all his old pain and bitterness melting away in the face of his son's uncomplicated love and need. "I never knew I could feel like this," he confessed to Violet one night as they lay in bed with Joshua asleep between them. "Like everything before was just practice for this, for being his father and your husband. Like I finally understand what I am supposed to be doing with my life." "You are doing it perfectly," Violet assured him. "We both are." The years passed in their hidden valley, each season bringing its own challenges and joys. Joshua grew from baby to toddler to sturdy little boy, learning to walk and talk and explore his mountain home with fearless enthusiasm. Thomas taught him to track and hunt, to recognize animal signs and plant medicine, all the skills he would need to thrive in this environment. Violet taught him letters and numbers from the precious books they owned, told him stories, sang him songs from her childhood. When Joshua was 3, Violet became pregnant again. This time the pregnancy was easier, her body knowing what to do, and she delivered a healthy daughter in the spring. They named her Catherine Rose, and she had Violet's dark hair and delicate features but Thomas's stubborn jaw. Joshua was fascinated by his baby sister, constantly wanting to hold her and help with her care. 2 years later came another son, Samuel James, who was the image of Thomas as a baby according to the one daguerreotype Thomas had kept from his old life. The cabin became crowded with 3 children, noisy and chaotic in the best possible way. Thomas expanded the structure, adding another room and a proper loft, creating more space for their growing family. They were isolated but never lonely, self-sufficient but never lacking. Thomas made regular trips to Silverton to trade furs and buy supplies, and occasionally they would have visitors, other trappers or mountain men passing through who would share news and meals and stories. But mostly it was just the 5 of them, their own small world where love mattered more than money or status, where the stars shone bright every night and the fire burned warm in the hearth. Joshua proved to have his father's intelligence and his mother's courage, becoming a skilled hunter by the time he was 10. Catherine was fierce and independent, insisting on learning all the same skills as her brother, refusing to be limited by what girls were supposed to do. Samuel was quieter, more thoughtful, with a gift for working with his hands, carving and building things with remarkable precision. When Joshua was 12, he asked about the world beyond the mountains. Thomas and Violet had always been honest with the children about their past, about the choices that had brought them to the valley, and the life they had left behind. Now Joshua wanted to see it for himself, to understand what they had given up and whether he might want something different for his own future. Thomas took all 3 children to Silverton that summer, a week-long trip that let them experience civilization for the first time. They stayed in a boarding house, ate in restaurants, walked on proper streets, and saw all the wonders that Violet and Thomas had once taken for granted. The children were fascinated and overwhelmed in equal measure, drinking in every new experience with wide eyes. But at the end of the week, when Thomas asked if any of them wanted to stay, to go to school in town or live with other families who might take them in, all 3 children emphatically refused. The mountains were their home, they said. The valley was where they belonged. Nothing in Silverton was as good as what they had with their parents in the high country. Thomas and Violet exchanged glances over their children's heads, seeing their own relief mirrored in each other's eyes. They had worried that their children might feel cheated, might resent the unconventional life they had been born into. But the opposite was true. Joshua, Catherine, and Samuel understood that what they had was special, precious, worth more than all the comforts and conveniences of civilization. The years continued to unfold, seasons turning into decades. The children grew into young adults, capable and confident, eventually leaving the valley to make their own way in the world but always returning home for visits. Joshua became a guide, leading hunting and trapping expeditions into the high country. Catherine married a young surveyor and moved to Denver but visited every summer with her growing family. Samuel took over a general store in Silverton and used it as a base to support his parents as they aged. Thomas and Violet grew old together in their mountain valley, their hair turning gray, their bodies slowing down but their love never diminishing. They had built something real, something lasting, a family and a life that had started with a coach accident and a whispered confession about fear of the dark. On their 30th wedding anniversary, they sat together on the porch of their cabin, watching the sunset paint the peaks in shades of gold and crimson. Their grandchildren were splashing in the lake under Joshua's watchful eye, their laughter carrying across the water. Catherine was helping prepare dinner inside, and Samuel had just arrived with fresh supplies from town. "You ever regret it?" Thomas asked quietly, "giving up everything for this life?" Violet looked at him, at the man who had saved her life and then given her a reason to truly live it, and she smiled. "Not for a single moment. You kept your promise, Thomas Jennings. You have been my light forever. And you have been mine." He took her hand, his grip still strong despite the years. "I love you, Violet, more today than the day I married you, more than I thought possible to love anyone. I love you too, always and forever." As darkness fell, Thomas built up the fire in the hearth, a habit of 30 years that he had never broken. The flames leaped and danced, casting warm light across the cabin and pushing back the night. Their grandchildren came running in from the lake, demanding stories and attention. The cabin filled with noise and love and laughter. 3 generations gathered together in this place that had started as a refuge and become a home. Violet looked around at her family, at the life she and Thomas had created from nothing but determination and love, and felt profoundly grateful. She had been so afraid once, afraid of the dark and of her own future, convinced she had no choice but to accept what others decided for her. But that coach accident had given her a different path, and Thomas had given her the courage to take it. They had built something extraordinary together, she and her mountain man, something that would last long after they were gone. Their children would tell their children about the grandmother who chose love over security, and the grandfather who came back from the war broken but found healing in the mountains. They would tell about how 2 lonely people found each other against all odds and created a family, a legacy, a love story for the ages. The fire burned bright in the hearth, as it always did, as it always would. And in its dancing light, Violet and Thomas sat together, hands entwined, hearts full, complete in a way that few people ever achieve. They had found each other in the darkness and become each other's light, forever and always, exactly as promised on that first terrifying night when a mountain man saved a frightened woman, and both of their lives changed forever. Years later, when Thomas finally passed away peacefully in his sleep at the age of 78, Violet mourned him deeply but without despair. He had given her 42 years of devoted love, had kept every promise he ever made, and had left her surrounded by children and grandchildren who would carry his memory and his lessons forward. She lived for 3 more years after his death, spending her final days in the valley they had made their own, tending the garden and telling stories to her great-grandchildren about their remarkable grandfather. When Violet died, she was buried next to Thomas on a hillside overlooking the lake, where wildflowers bloomed every spring, and the mountains stood eternal watch. Their descendants continued to visit the valley for generations, maintaining the cabin, keeping the memory alive, ensuring that the love story of Thomas and Violet Jennings would never be forgotten. Because some loves are so powerful, so transformative, that they echo through time itself. Some loves change not just the people who experience them, but everyone those people touch, rippling outward in ways that can never be fully measured. Thomas and Violet had found that kind of love, had chosen it despite all the obstacles and challenges, and had built a life that proved love was not just a feeling but a decision, made new each day, honored through action and sacrifice and unwavering commitment. In the end, that was their legacy. Not wealth or status or recognition from the wider world, but love. Pure, honest, enduring love that had started with a simple promise to keep the darkness at bay and had grown into something magnificent. They had been each other's light, each other's home, each other's everything. And that was more than enough. That was everything. The fire Thomas built on that first night had never truly gone out. It burned still in the hearts of everyone who knew their story, a reminder that love could be found in the most unexpected places, that courage meant choosing your own path, and that sometimes the greatest adventures began with the simple words spoken between two people who saw in each other exactly what they had been searching for all along.